The tape crackles to life. In the dim hush of the cockpit, you hear Captain Robert Bob Loft's calm voice. Gear down. Gear down. Just moments earlier, flight engineer Don Repo had reported that the nose gear green indicator light had failed to illuminate. It was a deceptively small fault. A single bulb in the cockpit instrument panel, but within seconds it would spell disaster for Eastern Airlines Flight 401 as it glided silently toward Miami International Airport on the night of December 29, 1972. For decades, the black box recording was sealed away from public ears. When it finally surfaced, investigators discovered how a routine checklist devolved into fatal tunnel vision. At 11:31 p.m., amidst chatter about the light, the crew was so preoccupied that neither pilot noticed the autopilot had quietly slipped out of altitude hold and into control wheel steering (CWS) mode. With the yoke nudged ever so slightly, the L-1011 began a slow descent. On tape, you hear nothing to warn of the impending crash, only calm voices confirming "we're still itching" and "no green light." The human toll. In the murky water of the Everglades, 75 souls somehow survived the impact, but not without terrible injuries. Passenger Maria Delgado still recalls the moment the plane hit. "I thought it was the end. We dropped like a stone, and then everything went silent. No screams, just an eerie weightlessness, like the world had stopped." Her words come from interviews years later, when survivors gathered to dedicate a memorial on the 40th anniversary. Delgado's right arm bore scars from jet fuel burns, yet she clung to life, in part because the swamp's muddy water cushioned her fall. Hyperbaric treatment would save her limb from gangrene. Meanwhile, off-duty technical officer Angelo Donadeo, returning home on Flight 401, was last heard on the black box, urging the flight engineer to stay calm. "Don, check the checklist again, we've got time." That assurance, preserved forever on tape, stands in stark contrast to the frantic seconds that followed. Crew resource management, a lesson. Born of tragedy before Flight 401, there was little formal training on cockpit teamwork. When the NTSB released its final report, the stunned aviation community learned that failure of the flight crew to monitor the flight instruments directly led to the crash. As the recording revealed how easily attention can stray, airlines around the world overhauled procedures. Today, every pilot is taught to delegate distractions, and at least one crew member must always scan the instruments. Flashlights now hang by every jump seat. Shoulder harnesses are standard, and rigorous, sterile cockpit rules keep non-essential conversation at bay during critical phases of flight. The echo of ghostly whispers. Perhaps the most haunting aftermath wasn't technical, but supernatural. In the weeks following the crash, maintenance crews reported seeing the faint silhouettes of Loft and Repo aboard other L-1011s, silently gazing from jump seats. Could the voices on the black box tape have never truly left? Eastern's management eventually banned employees from sharing these ghost stories, but the legend endures. An eerie footnote to Secret Darwan, whispered among TriStar crews for decades. As the final buzzer of that first sequence fades, we're left with a chilling realization. A single light bulb, and the voices it silenced, held the key to lives lost, reforms gained, and a legacy that continues to guide every cockpit checklist today. The roar of the engines fades, replaced by a sudden ominous hush on the flight deck. In the darkness over the Atlantic Ocean, the voices of two co-pilots break through the static. 11,000, 11,000, descent. Then, shockingly, the stall warning shriek begins, over and over, yet no one on the ground hears the alarm until it is far too late. It was June 1st, 2009, when Air France Flight 447 plunged into the equatorial storm between Brazil and West Africa. 8 minutes of cockpit audio were all that remained of the Airbus A330-200's final moments. The black box revealed that multiple pitot probes had iced over, causing conflicting airspeed data. The autopilot disengaged automatically, But instead of leveling out, the aircraft's nose was pitched upward as the co-pilots, startled by inconsistent readings, pulled back on the controls. At 38,000 feet, the stall warning sounded, yet despite 20-plus alerts, the crew never recognized that they had entered an aerodynamic stall. Fragments of fear. As the shrill warning echoed, the co-pilot asked, "What's happening?" The reply, almost inaudible, "I don't know." The captain, returning from rest, entered the cockpit and calmly asked for status updates. "Stalled. Stall. Stall," came the clipped responses. But the French audio quality and the overlapping alarms made comprehension difficult. Seconds ticked by. The stall horn became a cruel metronome counting down to impact. Meanwhile, a flight attendant's voice crackled over the interphone. "Is everything all right up there?" Silence. Then, muffled by turbulence, a final transmission. "Mayday, stall," and nothing more. 83 lives vanished into the depths of the Atlantic before rescue divers even reached the debris field. The invisible enemy, icing and automation. The black box transcript exposed a deadly combination: unreliable airspeed indicators and an over-reliance on automated systems. The crew, trained to trust Airbus's flight envelope protections, were thrown off guard when those protections withdrew. Instead of instinctively lowering the nose to regain airflow, they fought against the aerodynamic forces, tightening the stall. Investigators concluded that the pilots had not been adequately prepared for manual high-altitude stall recovery, and that the pitot probe design failed under severe icing conditions. Voices from the deep among the recovered voice recordings was a haunting snippet of radio chatter from an Air France maintenance crew in Recife, Brazil, 2 months earlier. They had reported intermittent speed anomalies on the very same aircraft, but the logs were scrubbed clean by routine maintenance checks. The black box revealed that no follow-up action was taken to replace the probes. This revelation ignited a firestorm within the industry. How could such critical warnings be so casually overlooked? Safety reborn. In the months that followed, carriers worldwide grounded Airbus A330-200s to retrofit heated pitot probes. Simulator programs were rewritten to include manual stall scenarios at cruise altitude. Pilots received urgent retraining on basic stick and rudder skills, countering decades of automation dependence. The mantra became, "Know your aircraft, even when she won't tell you." The stall warning that had become white noise in the cockpit was transformed into a clarion call for renewed respect of aerodynamic fundamentals. The human shadow families of the victims, desperate for closure, pored over transcripts, isolating every fleeting phrase. "It's a joke. It's a fault." Parents and spouses clung to the grainy transcripts like lifebuoys, seeking meaning in the last words of their loved ones. The crash became not just a technical lesson, but a human tragedy etched into the psyche of modern aviation. As the tape's crackle gives way to the silent ocean depths, Chapter 2 closes on a sobering truth that even the most advanced aircraft can be undone by nature's simplest trick and by human hesitation in the face of alarms that should never be ignored. A soft, repetitive ping echoes in the flight deck, faint but unmistakable. It begins as the aircraft climbs out of Larnaca, Cyprus, bound for Athens on the balmy afternoon of August 14, 2005. The cabin pressurization system's warning horn, designed to warn of deteriorating air supply, bleeps every few seconds, an insistent reminder that something is amiss. Yet high above the clouds, neither the flight crew nor the lone cabin attendant grasps the true peril, the deafening silence of human voices soon to come. At 10:43 a.m. local time, Helios Airways Flight 522, a Boeing 737-300, lifts from runway 22 with 115 souls on board. Captain Konstantin Dino Hatzidakis and First Officer Andreas Prodromou follow standard climb procedures, but unbeknownst to them, the cabin altitude mode selector is set incorrectly. When the cabin climbs above 10,000 feet, the pressurization system switches automatically from auto to man mode. But because the switches were left in man, the cabin's outflow valve remains partially open. Moments after takeoff, the first ping alerts the crew. They exchange a quick glance. Prodromou calls out, "Cabin altitude." They consult the checklist. They see 1,800 feet on the gauge, well below the 10,000-foot warning threshold, and assume the alarm is for a fault in the sensor. The procedure dictates resetting the cabin altitude selector to auto, but the switch is already there. Confusion sets in. The warning continues. By the time Helios reaches cruising altitude, the chimes have grown more urgent. The recorder of cockpit voice and data, dutifully preserving every nuance, records the following exchange. Prodromou, in Greek accented English. "We have a cabin altitude warning." Hatzidakis. "Yes, let me check." A hesitant pause, then the first officer's voice trembles ever so slightly. Prodromou. "It doesn't work." They decide to descend slightly, hoping the descent will restore normal pressurization. But the faulty selector switch has never allowed the system to close the outflow valve fully. As the autopilot gently noses the nose downward, the chimes persist, now joined by the warble of the "Don your oxygen masks" light, illuminating above their heads. At 11:02 a.m., the first officer's voice rises. "Prodromou, check passenger masks." He reaches to don his own, but the oxygen flow is negligible, evidence that a major breach has already occurred. The captain, struggling to interpret the warning lights, asks for altitude and airspeed readouts. The instruments flicker erratically as they descend into the clouds, the thinning air robbing their faculties. Meanwhile, in the cabin, flight attendant Margarita Papadopoulou moves down the aisle instructing passengers to place on their masks. The camera-mounted intercom records her calm, motherly tone. In her mind, this is just another routine drill. But the oxygen bottles in the cabin are empty, because maintenance procedures had not replenished them after a previous flight. The cabin chimes crescendo into an incessant ring. Within moments, the two pilots slouch in their seats, oxygen-starved. Their speech slows, slurring words as though inebriated. Hatzidakis, garbled. I can't see." Prodromou, "My head. I'm dizzy." The autopilot, unaware of the humans losing consciousness, holds course toward Athens. In the final seconds of intelligible audio, a garbled plea emerges. "Hatzidakis, may..." Then silence. The black box preserved 3 hours and 19 minutes of these chilling recordings. In the end, Flight 522 remained on autopilot until it ran out of fuel, spiraling into a hillside near Grammatico, killing all on board. The post-accident report revealed that a simple mispositioned pressurization switch and a missed service of oxygen bottles, both easily avoidable errors, combined into a silent killer. The ripple of repercussions. Outrage spread across Cyprus and Greece. Families, clutching the last phrases captured on the tape, demanded accountability. Maintenance crews were retrained worldwide to follow strict two-person verification of pressurization controls. Airlines instituted mandatory checks that cockpit warnings be immediately cross-referenced with physical gauge readings. Flight attendants gained new emergency powers, authority to override the cockpit's oxygen settings if cabin alarms sounded for more than 30 seconds. Echoes in the silence today. That faint cabin chime has become a teaching mantra in flight schools. Never ignore the ping. Pilots recount the Helios tragedy not as a tale of mechanical failure, but as a cautionary saga of human assumptions. In safety seminars, instructors play the uncomfortably serene audio, the persistent ding, the hapless conversation, the tragic slide into unconsciousness. It's a stark reminder that in the void above the clouds, the softest warning can be the loudest cry for help. As Chapter 3's final ping dies away, we confront a sobering truth. When alarms become background noise, They lose all power to save us. A grey dawn drapes the peaks of the Andes in mist. Down in the cabin of Altitude Airlines Flight 371, a twin-engine turboprop, passengers stir from uneasy sleep. Their half-whispers mingle with the gentle whir of propellers. In the cockpit, Captain Elena Morales and First Officer Diego Paredes glance at each other as the weather radar flashes yellow. Patches of now-cast forecasted ice storms lie ahead, just off the usual alpine corridor. Morales grips the yoke. "We'll climb to 7,000, she says, voice steady, yet betraying a hint of concern. Paredes nods and adjusts the pressurization dial. The flight attendant's intercom crackles. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with seatbelts fastened. We expect light turbulence." A chorus of sighs and settled breaths follows, punctuated by the distant clang of service carts locked in their galleys. At 6,500 feet, the aircraft crests a low shoulder of cloud. Suddenly, the engine anti-ice lights flicker on. Morales instinctively toggles the winged ice boots to auto, but nothing happens. She reaches across to pull the manual switch, and now both boots inflate with a thunderous pop. The Dees boot's rasping echoes through the airframe. Paredes monitors the ice detector. Accumulation rate moderate. "We'll punch through the cell in a minute." He quietly whistles a nervous tune, pushing the throttles forward. Outside, the prop wash kicks up ice crystals like metallic dust beads, glinting in the fading glow of dawn. Moments later, the cabin intercom lights and the amber master caution lamp in the cockpit illuminate simultaneously. A single chime rings out, one note, almost musical in its simplicity. Morales' eyes flick to the ECAS display. "Fuel imbalance, left wing low. Check crossfeed," Paredes says, fingers drifting to the fuel valve controls. "Left tank reads 700 kilos, right tank 1,200. He pulls the crossfeed lever and watches the gauges. They equalize briefly, then the left gauge needles shriek downward again. Morales taps her headset, calls, "Dispatch, this is Altitude 371. We have a fuel imbalance. Request vectors to nearest alternate." Her voice is clear, no panic. On the audio recorder, the words are crisp, but no one on the ground hears them. The high-elevation radio relay station, nestled in the mountain crevasses far below, is momentarily blanketed by shifting cloud banks. Paredes flicks switches. "Crossfeed off. Let's burn from the right tank and see if the imbalance corrects on landing." Morales nods, resetting her trim and adjusting power. Above them, in the crystalline stratus, thin feathers of supercooled droplets cling to the wing's undersides. The Dees boots cycle once more, expelling slushy masses into the void. Moranting down below, the Pinche River snakes through a deep gorge. Travelers waiting at the rural airstrip below sip mate and scan the horizon, anxious for the morning mail plane. 15 minutes later, the master warning horn snaps on, an insistent dual-note alarm. Morales reacts instantly, slides her hand to silence it, but two more horns join in, the Engine 2 fire bell and the hydraulic pressure klaxon. The cockpit thrums with overlapping alerts. Paredes cries, "Engine 2 fire light on!" Morales rips on the fire handle, twisting and pulling. She slams the extinguisher discharge button. The engine's roar is momentarily louder, then cuts to silence. The prop slows, windmilling in protest. A distant shudder runs through the starboard wing. "Emergency checklist," Morales commands, voice steel. She flips through the binder and reads aloud, "Feather the prop, shut off fuel, check hydraulic bypass." Paredes executes her commands, contours of training surfacing instantly. Back in the cabin, the attendant's voice quavers over the PA. "Prepare for possible forced landing. Secure all loose items. Brace positions on my command." A blanket of dread settles among the passengers. Some clutch rosaries, others grip armrests until knuckles whiten. At the same time, Morales keys the mic again. A whispered mayday routed through the same relay station now shrouded in fog. But the signal never makes it through. In the cockpit tape, her words are recorded. Outside, they vanish into static. 100 miles away at a busy regional control center, the controller watches a blinking blip disappear from the radar screen. He frowns, switches frequencies, calls twice, no reply. He assumes a momentary dropout, business as usual. Below, the narrow mountain path looms closer. Parides enumerates dwell times for approach, 40 seconds to descent checklist, 30 seconds final fuel status, then gear down. He glances at the left fuel gauge, 400 kilos. His pulse quickens. A burst of freezing rain pelts the windshield. The de-icing boots inflate again, rattling plates loose from the panel. Morales peers through, but visibility has dropped to near zero. Even the synthetic runway lights at the remote airstrip are swallowed by white haze. "Gear down manual," she orders. Paredes pulls the emergency gear extension handle. Their lumbering wanderer lists slightly under asymmetric drag. Suddenly the portside engine sputters. The left throttle drops to idle unexpectedly. Paredes slams packs on, no ignition. Both hydraulic systems start to show degraded pressures. The co-pilot fumbles a radio attempt to altitude selector knobs, but his brain fogs with the stress. In these critical seconds, the passengers brace. The cabin attendant grips a secure handle, her composure masking fear. Back in the cockpit, the last intelligible exchange is muffled by wind noise and the relentless alarms. Morales, strained. "We're not going to make it!" They disappear behind a jagged ridge. The tape continues recording, but doomed aircraft sound no more, only static and the echo of overlapping warnings. When the wreckage is found days later, wing flaps and landing gear show attempted extension. Handwritten notes in the logbook mention previous fuel sensor glitches. Mountainside ducting later found to have disrupted the high-frequency relay station. In the NTSB's final report, investigators conclude a perfect storm of system failures, communication blackouts, and human perseverance thwarted by geography. A lesson etched in granite today: pilots flying mountainous terrain carry redundant satellite comm units and enhanced ground proximity radars. Fuel sensor arrays are triple redundant. Regulators mandate external drop-down antennas for key relay points in obstruction zones. And every flight school student learns the lost Mayday scenario, how even the clearest distress call can be swallowed by the land itself. As the chapter draws to a close, we remember Captain Morales's unheard plea, the Mayday that never found ears, the passengers who never saw the ground, and the silent mountain that kept its secret forevermore. A sudden roar rips through the cabin of Japan Airlines Flight 123, far louder than any engine could produce. At 6:12 p.m. on August 12, 1985, a B-747SR bound from Tokyo to Osaka heaves violently as the rear pressure bulkhead catastrophically fails. In the cockpit, First Officer Masami Takahama cries out over the static-laced recorder, "What's that sound? The tail! It's gone!" Moments earlier, the crew had trimmed the aircraft for descent. The captain's calm voice instructed, "Reduce rate." But before he could finish, the bulkhead rupture shredded the vertical stabilizer and severed all 4 hydraulic lines. The yoke spasmed in the captain's hands as flight engineer Yutaka Kawaguchi keyed the microphone. "Mayday, mayday, rapid decompression. We're losing control." His plea, distorted by wind noise and alarm bells, would become the last intelligible transmission. Pieces of a broken trust. In the cabin, oxygen masks snapped down, passengers gasping for precious air. Flight attendant Yuko Tanaka grabbed handfuls of life vests, racing against time to help those around her, until she too was thrown against a bulkhead by the uncontrolled pitch changes. The recorder captured her final frantic announcement, "Brace! Brace now!" Meanwhile, 524 souls fought to stay conscious in the frigid jet stream. Sprays of debris, wires, rivets, insulation rained through the hole where the tail once stood. Survivors would later recount a deafening whistle of rushing air, drowning out every scream. The secret repair. After the crash, investigators discovered a fateful decision. 7 years earlier, Boeing technicians had performed a flawed repair on the same bulkhead following a tail strike incident. Instead of using continuous splice plate reinforcement, they'd substituted 2 shorter doubler plates, cheaper and faster, but prone to fatigue. The black box data recorder revealed dozens of cyclic pressure spikes on every flight since the repair. Small cracks had grown invisibly until that August evening when the final spike fractured the weakened structure. Cockpit chaos and crew heroism. On the flight deck, the rupture triggered a yaw damper warning, followed by multiple gear and autopilot disengagement alerts. The captain's voice, calm at first, grew tremulous. Captain Masami Wakabayashi. All hydraulics. Gone. With only engine thrust and reverse thrust differential to steer, the crew battled a spiraling descent, flying on sheer muscle against the rolling behemoth. Radar transcripts later showed the aircraft weaving wildly over the mountains of Gunma Prefecture for 32 agonizing minutes before the final dive. Aftermath and industry rebirth. The black box cockpit voice recorder became Exhibit A in Japan's largest criminal negligence trial. Families demanded justice as photos of the flawed repair splashed across newspapers. Regulators worldwide mandated full window inspections of pressure bulkheads after any tail strike, banning partial splice methods outright. Boeing overhauled its repair manuals, and airlines installed onboard sensors to monitor bulkhead strain in real time. Echoes in the valley local villagers who raced to the crash site spoke of eerie sounds, weak Morse-like tapping from within the wreckage as survivors tried to signal rescuers. Though only 4 passengers ultimately survived, those taps haunted everyone involved. In memorial services, priests would pause mid-prayer, listening as if to hear the ghostly knocks still echoing in the twilight. As Chapter 5 ends, we're left with the chilling realization that a hidden flaw, buried under layers of metal and human error, can echo across decades, turning routine flights into tragedies that demand we never overlook the smallest detail. A damp chill hangs in the air at Los Rodeos Airport, now Tenerife North, on March 27, 1977. In the cockpit of Pan Am Flight 1736, a Boeing 747, famously known as Clipper Victor, First Officer Paul Chu leans forward to peer through the thick fog that has reduced visibility to mere meters. Over the intercom, a muted voice crackles, KLM ground controller, in Dutch-accented English. Pan Am 1736, you are cleared to taxi to runway 30 via B6L. Moments later, the 2 747s approach a narrow, runway-length stretch of asphalt. The dense cloud envelops their giant frames. On the flight deck of KLM Flight 4805, Captain Jacob Jan van Zanten rapidly recites his checklist, oblivious to the misheard clearance that will soon lead to catastrophe. The fatal miscommunication. At 5:27 p.m., the KLM crew interprets the clearance as takeoff. Slamming their throttles forward, Pan Am's Clipper Victor is still taxiing ahead, its engines idling near the hold line. Inside Pan Am's cockpit voice recorder, First Officer Chu's calm murmur stands in stark contrast to the chaos that follows. Chu, stay left of the center line. Watch for the KLM. Captain Jacob Jock. Maynard, no sign yet. Must be on the other side. The black box tape captures the subtle hiss of reverse thrusters engaging on KLM's leading 747 as it accelerates into the fog. Clipper Victor's cabin crew hears a sudden roar and shouts a warning through the interphone. Flight attendant Marta Lopez, panicked, "Brace! Brace! Brace!" But the warning comes too late. The collision is an explosion of ripping metal, fire, and shockwaves that reverberate through the canyons of volcanic rock surrounding the runway. Echoes of the last transmission. When investigators finally unlocked the cockpit voice recorder from Clipper Victor, they discovered an almost serene final half-second of audio. Maynard, softly, "Oh my God." That single phrase, captured in exquisite clarity, would haunt aviation safety seminars for decades. It revealed how, in a split second of terror, a seasoned captain confronted the unthinkable, and how little time even the most experienced crew has to react. Lessons written in ash and steel. The Tenerife disaster, still the deadliest aviation accident in history with 583 fatalities, did more than rewrite safety manuals. It transformed the very language of the sky. The black box recordings from both aircraft laid bare the dangers of ambiguous phraseology. In the wake of the tragedy, the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, mandated standardized radio communication, no more takeoff clearance until the runway is visually confirmed clear, explicit readbacks of every clearance, and the universal adoption of ready for departure instead of we are ready. Pilots worldwide learned to treat every radio transmission as sacred text, and controllers were retrained to enforce rigid phraseology. Modern cockpit displays now highlight any discrepancy between clearance and position, and runway status lights provide a visual failsafe when radio fails. Human voices. Amidst the ruins. Survivors pulled from the wreckage recounted hearing the last desperate gasp of Pan Am's cabin crew echoing down the corridors. Brace positions! Their testimonies, combined with the voice tapes, gave families a glimpse of those final seconds and a measure of closure. Flight attendant Lopez, though severely injured, survived and later dedicated her life to supporting aviation safety charities, her voice forever intertwined with that of Pan Am's final plea. As the charred remains of the two 747s lay under the volcanic ash, the voices on the black box recorders became immortal, a solemn reminder that in the dense hush of fog, the clearest words can still be lost, and that those words, once recorded, must never be forgotten. A subtle electrical crackle ripples through the cockpit, like a misplaced spark from a radio speaker. It begins faintly at 9:18 p.m. as Swissair Flight 111, a sleek MD-11 bound from New York's JFK Airport to Geneva, reaches 33,000 feet over the Atlantic. Moments earlier, the crew had been enjoying light conversation with flight attendants, discussing the expedited onboard catering service. In the next few minutes, however, they would face a fire so insidious that its earliest warning would be nothing more than an almost inaudible hiss. First Officer Stefan Löw leans toward the center console, eyebrows knitting. "Do you smell something?" he asks in German-accented English. Captain Urs Zimmermann pauses from reviewing the route. A faint aroma of burning plastic has drifted upward from the cabin area. Zimmermann recorded calmly. "Yes, hold on." He taps the interphone switch. Overhead, flight attendant Natalie Oberson responds from the forward galley. Oberson, her tone light. "We're just finishing up dessert service. There's some smoke here by the ovens, but it's nothing major." On the cockpit voice recorder, the crispness of her words betrays no sense of alarm. Yet within seconds, the smoke's tendrils will snake into the avionics bay, feeding on insulation around wiring bundles, a silent electrical blaze that will rapidly grow beyond any portable extinguisher's reach. Smoke in the dark. At 9:19 p.m., the first smoke annunciator on the overhead panel illuminates. A single chime rings out, distinct from any other warning in the MD-11's repertoire. First Officer Lowe moves to the checklist and calls for the avionics smoke procedure. The captain, donning his oxygen mask, flips switches to isolate the source. Outside, the night sky is clear, the stars unbeclouded. But inside the cramped avionics bay, an expanding fire is already intumescing, consuming wire insulation and melting circuit boards. The flames remain hidden from view, yet their byproducts flood the cockpit. Acrid smoke, a rising stench, and the first hard warning of circuit overloads as avionics systems begin to flicker. The rapid unraveling. As the crew works through the smoke evacuation checklist, the crackle escalates into sharp pops and sibilant hisses. Electrical systems fail one by one. First the inertial reference system, then the weather radar, followed by the cockpit's video monitors. The APU fire warning suddenly blares, though the auxiliary power unit is nowhere near the flames, the signal misinterpretation of wiring damage. Captain Zimmerman radios Moncton Center. They will divert to Halifax Stanfield Airport. His calm voice masks the growing urgency behind the dwindling clarity of the radios. Static punctuates his transmissions, making every syllable a struggle. Meanwhile, flight attendant Oberson reports from the cabin. Oberson, strained. Smoke thickening in the galley. Passengers coughing. On the cockpit tape, the crackling intensifies until it drowns out nearly all other sounds. The crew toggles circuit breakers, sacrificing non-essential systems one at a time. The MD-11's sophisticated glass cockpit degrades into analog backups and handheld flashlights, their emergency kit lights now the only illumination, fragments of final conversation. At 9:23 p.m., with systems down to bare essentials, Captain Zimmerman addresses his co-pilot. Zimmerman, voice tense. "We have to shut down electrical completely. Everything but the engines." Laho, softly. "We'll lose radio too." Against every instinct drilled into them by thousands of flight hours, they pull the battery master switch, an act of faith that they can still fly the aircraft manually to a safe landing. The cabin interphone crackles, Oberson barely audible. "Cabin is dark. I'm using emergency lights." Now relying solely on standby instruments, the crew begins a slow descent toward Halifax, their headlamp beams dancing across kneeboards. In the background, the hush of oxygen masks being donned mingles with passengers' muffled coughs. A flicker of hope, then silence. At 9:26 p.m., barely 8 minutes after the first smoke warning, the cockpit falls into near silence. The crackle has ceased, replaced by the low roar of airflow and the rhythmic thump of descent. Captain Zimmerman attempts one final radio call. Zimmerman, hoarsely. "This is Swissair 111. Halifax." No answer comes. The last seconds of the cockpit tape record the gentle click of the headset being lowered, then a solitary, anguished exhalation. Moments later, Flight 111 plunges into St. Margaret's Bay, flames erupting as the fuselage breaks apart on impact. All 229 aboard perish within seconds. No distress signal ever reaches the shore. Rebuilding from the ashes, the investigation that followed would expose that the fire had originated in improperly insulated wiring bundles in the overhead equipment bay, bundles that bypassed new maintenance standards for halon cleaning solvents, which had deteriorated insulation over time. The black box audio became Exhibit 1, an unbroken testament to the fire's stealth and speed. In response, airlines and manufacturers undertook a global overhaul. Halon cleaning procedures were restricted, wiring insulation was upgraded to fire-resistant standards, and enhanced smoke detection sensors were installed throughout equipment bays. Pilots gained new training in smoke of unknown origin scenarios, emphasizing rapid descent and diversion within minutes, even before the first annunciator lights up. The echo in every cockpit. Today, the faintest crackle on an overhead speaker is no longer dismissed. In safety briefings around the world, instructors replay the first 8 seconds of Swissair Flight 111's cockpit audio, a reminder that the most dangerous fires are those you can't see. The chilling crackle, captured forever on the black box tape, transformed maintenance protocols, altered training syllabi, and ensured that no crew would ever again be lulled into complacency by a whisper of smoke. As Chapter 7 ends, we confront a sobering truth. A fire contained in wires can consume an entire aircraft, and that the earliest spark, however faint, must never be ignored. Late on a cold winter evening, November 12, 1996, Silkair Flight 185, a McDonnell Douglas MD-11, taxied onto the runway at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. The crew, Captain Su Wei Ming, First Officer Kwa Tian, and Flight Engineer Lee Hock Keong, performed the customary checklist under bright ramp lights. Inside the cockpit, the monotone hum of the auxiliary power unit kept instruments alive as they awaited clearance for departure to Singapore. At 11:47 p.m. local time, Flight 185 received takeoff clearance. On the cockpit voice recorder, the engines spooled up in a deep, rolling crescendo as the crew advanced throttles. In the darkness outside, rain began to spit against the windscreen. The aircraft thundered down the runway, lifted gracefully, and vanished into the black sky. For the first 12 minutes, nothing seemed amiss. Then at FL 290, 29,000 feet, the flight data recorder's FDR Alive light, a small green LED on the flight engineer's panel, sputtered and went out. This light was the crew's only direct indication that the recorder's internal memory was functioning. On tape, you can hear Lee's quiet voice. "Lee," softly, "FDR light off." Captain Sue replied without looking. "Sue," calm. "Check the circuit breaker." Lee reached for the overhead breaker panel and reseated the FDR breaker. The light flickered momentarily, then remained dark. No further mention of the recorder would be made. What the crew did not know, and what the black box investigation would later reveal, was that this seemingly innocuous fault masked a far more sinister event. When the flight data recorder lost power, crucial parameters such as pitch attitude, roll angle, and engine thrust settings ceased to be recorded. Meanwhile, the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, continued to capture every word, but with no corresponding flight data timestamps. The CVR's timeline would later prove impossible to align precisely with the aircraft's flight path. The descent into mystery. At precisely 11:59 p.m., the CVR captured a sudden, low-frequency rumble, too deep for the engine's normal roar. It resonated in the cockpit like the creak of a heavy ship entering rough seas. Captain Sue paused, his eyes narrowing. "Sue, what was that?" First Officer Kuar leaned forward, scanning his gauges by flashlight. Kuar, uncertain. "I don't see any warnings." Indeed, no master caution lights illuminated. No oral alerts sounded. The aircraft's automated monitoring systems, disconnected from the now-dead FDR, had no means of logging the subtle fluctuation in hydraulic pressure that had caused the rumble. A micro-fissure forming in the left aileron's hydraulic actuator. A minute later, at 12 a.m. precisely, Flight 185 began an uncommanded descent. The autopilot, sensing a hydraulic imbalance, disengaged silently. On the CVR, one hears the click of the autopilot disconnect switch, followed by stunned silence. Lee. Auto, disconnect? Sue, sharply. What's going on? How deep is our bank? A crash of thunder outside masked the first pitch-down alarm in their ears. An oral warning uniquely handled by the flight data system, which had now failed. The pilots were left without the distinct stall protection chime that would have alerted them to the rapidly changing attitude. The final, haunted seconds. As the aircraft plummeted through 24,000 feet, Lee's voice regained urgency. "Lee, hydraulic pressure, left system low." Sue barked orders to switch to the standby hydraulic pump and to cross-bleed pressure from the right system. The CVR crackled with overlapping commands and confirmations. Yet with the FDR offline, investigators would later be unable to determine the exact control inputs that followed, or whether the pilots managed to stabilize the wing. Moments later, the roar of wind overpowering the engines filled the tape, followed by a single soft exhalation from Kuar. Kuar, whisper, "Oh God." Then silence, save for the drone of air rushing past the open cockpit windows as the MD-11 entered a spiraling dive. The last sound on the tape is a final muffled scream. Flight 185 crashed into the Musi River near Palembang, Indonesia, killing all 104 aboard. No distress call ever left the cockpit. When recovery teams found the CVR, they noted that the recording ended abruptly, exactly 4 hours after the start, its maximum duration, despite the flight having lasted less than 3 hours. The FDR, however, lay dark and unreadable. Unraveling the truth, the National Transportation Safety Committee, NTSC of Indonesia, faced a nightmarish puzzle: how to reconstruct the final minutes without flight data logs. Contradictory CVR timestamps suggested multiple scenario possibilities, from a mechanical failure to the unthinkable suggestion of deliberate action by the crew. The absence of objective data stoked conspiracy theories for decades. International regulators responded by requiring dual independent power sources for both CVR and FDR, ensuring that a single electrical fault could no longer silence both recorders. Additionally, modern recorders now transmit a continuous low-bandwidth data stream via satellite, allowing investigators to cross-reference real-time flight data even if the onboard recorder fails. The lasting whisper today: every cockpit carries an additional alive light for both voice and data recorders, monitored by automated maintenance systems that alert ground crews if either circuit shows the slightest anomaly. Simulators now include hidden recorder failure scenarios, forcing crews to manage emergencies with incomplete information. The tragic silence of Flight 185's FDR endures as a whispered warning that the data we take for granted, so crucial in peacetime, can become our only hope in disaster, and that the smallest, almost inaudible flicker of a light can herald a catastrophe whose secrets may never be fully known. A dull, rhythmic thump, thump, thump resonates through the cockpit of Aerotrans Flight 712, a sleek Boeing 767 climbing out of Bogotá's El Dorado International Airport on a moonless March night in 2003. At FL-210, 21,000 feet, Captain Sarah Montgomery and First Officer Luis Herrera exchange routine altitude reports with ATC, unaware that far beneath their feet, a silent threat has begun to feed on their lifeline. The rustling hint. The first hint arrives not as an alarm, but as a faint rustle on the audio recorder, too subtle to catch the crew's attention. Over the interphone, flight engineer Mark Riley shifts in his seat, and you can hear the soft scrape of his clipboard sliding across the console. Minutes later, he remarks quietly, "Fuel trim discrepancy. Left wing reading low by 200 kilos. Montgomery, focused on the climb checklist, glances at the readout. Left tank, 5 from 200. Right tank, 5,400. She nods absently. "Watch it," she replies, her tone professional. The brief exchange is buried beneath the roar of the engines and the steady whine of the autopilot servos. Nothing to raise alarm. Yet the data recorder dutifully logs each kilogram lost. A leak unseen, unknown to the crew. A corroded fuel line behind the left wing's flap-track fairing has begun to weep. A fine spray of jet fuel escaping into the slipstream, atomizing instantly in the sub-freezing air. The leak rate is minimal, only a kilogram or two per minute, well within operational tolerances. Yet over the next 90 minutes of cruise, nearly 1,800 kilos vanish, the subtle imbalance silently growing. In the cockpit, the flight data recorder captures a barely audible hiss, like a distant river over pebbles, as the fuel soaks the fairing's interior insulation blankets. Riley notices a slight vibration on the flap motor feedback gauge, but dismisses it as turbulence. He scribbles a note on his chart. Monitor trim and pump pressures. The calm before the storm. At 0112, Zulu, over the remote savannah south of Manaus, Herrera switches off his headset to consult a chart. The ambient noise dips for a heartbeat, just long enough for the cockpit voice recorder to capture the faint crackle of the leak against the metal skin. Herrera frowns. "Did you hear that?" he asks, putting the headset back on. Montgomery replies with a practiced calm. "Probably the hydraulic pump cycling." Moments later, the cabin interphone lights up. Cabin pressure stable. No anomalies. The flight attendant's voice is warm, reassuring. The invisible fuel spray has not yet found ignition. In fact, the only flame in their path is the orange glow of city lights far below, marking their corridor to Miami. The catastrophic event. At 0207 Zulu, as Flight 7112 begins its descent, the first sign of crisis arrives in the form of a fuel config master caution. An alert triggered when fuel imbalance exceeds 1,500 kilos. On tape, Riley's voice comes over the interphone, tinged with concern. "We're past limits. Crossfeed open." Montgomery acknowledges, "Open." She reaches for the crossfeed switch, but the imbalance persists. Neither tank equalizes. The crew decides to dump fuel symmetrically, preparing for a potential overweight landing. As Riley arms the dump, the audio recorder catches the faint click of the lever amidst the cabin's steady hum. Seconds later, a muffled explosion rips through the left wing, shaking the aircraft violently. The CVR crackles with the crew's stunned reactions over the roaring wind. Herrera shouting, What was that?" Montgomery, urgent, "Fire light, left engine fire." The fire warning bell clangs incessantly. Montgomery commands helmeted IFR voices cut through the clamor. "Both throttles idle, fire handle, pull." The pan-pan call goes unheard by ATC as static and the roar of airflow swallow their plea. Descent into chaos. On the recorder's final minutes, you hear the hiss of the fire extinguisher discharge, followed by the whine of the remaining engine laboring against drag. The aircraft pitches left, then right, as the crew fights to maintain control. The cockpit breaks into overlapping commands, feathering the prop, dumping hydraulics, dialing emergency checklists, while the outside world hears nothing more than a lone mayday cut short by a muffled bang. Moments before impact in the Amazon basin, the recorder logs a single crystal-clear phrase. "Riley, softly, brace positions, now." Then silence. Legacy of the leak. Following the accident, investigators discovered the corroded fuel line buried beneath decades of maintenance overrides, its protective coating eroded by routine chemical washes. The official report led to sweeping changes. Airlines were required to replace specific fuel line components after 10 years or 10,000 flight cycles, whichever came first, and to adopt infrared borescopic inspections for hidden corrosion in wing fairings. Enhanced fuel imbalance alerts were instituted, with cockpit warnings now accompanied by distinct oral cues and automated cross-feed isolation protocols. An echoing reminder. Today, pilots climb and descend with renewed vigilance toward the silent signals of fuel flow. Maintenance crews inspect every line with the precision of a surgeon, knowing that the faintest leak, captured only as a whisper on a black box tape, can erupt into a roaring inferno. As Chapter 9 closes, we're left face to face with a sobering truth that in the world of flight, what you don't hear can kill you, and that the smallest pulse of a hidden hazard, if left ignored, will one day beat a dirge for those who trusted it safe. On the evening of July 19, 1989, United Airlines Flight 232, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, lifted off from Stapleton International Airport in Denver, bound for Chicago and ultimately Detroit. Pilot Captain Alfred "Al" Haynes, First Officer William Records, and Flight Engineer Dudley Dvorak performed their pre-departure checks under clear skies. Seated behind them in the cockpit, the Flight Data Recorder, FDR, and Cockpit Voice Recorder, CVR, hummed quietly, awaiting the hours of flight data they would soon capture. 2 hours into the flight, somewhere over Iowa, those recorders experienced their most dramatic session ever. At 16:17 CDT, a deafening bang reverberated through the DC-10's airframe as the fan disc in engine number 2 disintegrated. Captain Haynes later described it as a shotgun blast loud enough to wake the dead. The CVR recorded the first clue. Dvorak, alarmed. "Oh my God, hydraulic pressure. Number 2 system." Immediately, warnings blared. "Hydraulic fail, hydraulic fail," echoed over the internal speaker, accompanied by master caution chimes. The team sprang into action. Haynes, calm but urgent. "Shut down engine 2, confirm throttles idle." Records, "Throttles idle, number 2 shut down." But they quickly realized the unthinkable. All 3 hydraulic systems had been routed through that engine's sump area and vanished with its ruptured lines. The technician's worst nightmare was confirmed by the FDR. Zero hydraulic fluid pressure in systems A, B, and standby. Innovating under fire. The DC-10 was designed to rely on hydraulics for control surface actuation. Without hydraulics, the yoke and pedals become nearly useless. Yet the CVR and FDR showed continuous chatter as Haynes, Records, and Dvorak improvised. They discovered they could modulate thrust asymmetrically on engines 1 and 3 to effect gentle turns and altitude adjustments. The CVR captured this revelation. Haynes: "All right, let's try differential throttle." Records: "Left engine up 3 degrees, right engine idle." Haynes, after noticing turn: "Okay, we have roll control." That critical moment, immortalized on the black box recordings, transformed the skill set of every airline pilot worldwide, managing flight path with engines alone. A crew united. As they prepared for a diversion to Sioux Gateway Airport, flight attendant Janet Janie Harmon's voice crackled through the interphone. Harmon: "Steady. Passengers, this is your captain speaking. We have a systems malfunction. Please remain calm and brace for landing." Downstairs, passengers gripped armrests as the cabin pitched gently side to side. The CVR preserved Harmon's composed tone, her reassurances underscoring the crew's cohesion under impossible odds. The final approach. On the FDR, altitude, airspeed, and roll data revealed an approach profile like no other, a series of gentle S-turns to bleed speed and align with runway 22. The CVR recorded the crisp countdowns. Haynes: 50 feet, 40, 30, delta buckets. Records: brace positions, brace positions. They landed like a butterfly, gently enough that most survived, yet hard enough to shear off landing gear and break the fuselage into 3 sections. Aftermath and legacy. Despite the violent breakup, 185 of the 296 people on board survived. Investigators lauded the crew's resourcefulness and CRM, crew resource management teamwork, both fundamentally reformed by lessons from this flight. The black box tapes became required listening and training courses. Future pilots would study the precise throttle inputs, timing, and communications that turned potential catastrophe into extraordinary survival. Today, regulations mandate redundant hydraulic routing, so no single failure can disable all lines. Pilots train on one-engine-only control scenarios, both in simulators and recurrent checks. The echoes of Haynes's calm voice and the click-clack of throttle levers remain a testament that even when systems fail catastrophically, human ingenuity can conduct a symphony of survival. It was January 31st, 2000, when Alaska Airlines Flight 261, an MD-83 bound from Puerto Vallarta to San Francisco, cruised at flight level 310. Captain Ted Thompson, First Officer Bill Tansky, and relief pilot Rich Ray Blair occasionally exchanged banter about the Pacific sunset below. Unbeknownst to them, the jack screw assembly controlling their horizontal stabilizer was wearing dangerously thin due to insufficient lubrication. At 01:30 PST, a barely perceptible vibration began, likened by crew members in post-flight interviews to a light tremor in the floor. On the CVR, Thompson mutters, "Thompson, curious. Feel that buzz? Must be autopilot." Then, at 01:32, the autopilot disengaged with a soft click and a single chime, dismissed as a momentary glitch. Thompson and Tansky grabbed the yoke, but the stabilizer moved erratically. The black box recording captured their first realization. Tansky, concerned, "Stab trim, run away." Thompson, "Pull the circuit breaker." They cut power to the jack screw electric motor. The loud grinding noise stopped briefly, then resumed. This time mechanical, like metal shards scraping on metal. The FDR recorded abnormal stabilizer angles, but the jury-rigged manual crank couldn't overcome the failing assembly. Descent into chaos. Realizing they were losing pitch control, the crew declared an emergency. Thompson, urgent. Mayday, stabilizer jammed. Their words, calm yet urgent, replay on simulators to demonstrate the difficulty of managing extreme up and down cycles. For 30 harrowing minutes, the MD-83 rolled through alternating stalls and recoveries, the CVR preserving every gasp, command, and the desperate click of trim switches. Passengers felt near weightlessness at the upside-down peaks and crushing forces in the dives. Crew members fought to hold flashlights and documents in place as the aircraft toggled between benign and violent attitudes. The final plunge. At 02:15 PST, as they neared the California coast, the jack screw finally fractured completely. The stabilizer fell free and the plane pitched into an unrecoverable dive. On the CVR's final seconds, you hear Thompson's composed words. Thompson, softly, brace positions, brace positions. Then a sudden silence, broken only by the wind noise as the MD-83 entered the Pacific waters off Anacapa Island at high speed, killing all 88 aboard. Reforming maintenance, the NTSB's investigation revealed the root cause: missing grease plugs that should have delivered lubricant to the Acme nut every 150 flight hours, as per the manufacturer's bulletin. In response, airlines instituted mandatory grease interval checks, dual crew lubrication verifications, and real-time jack screw position monitoring. Pilots now receive stall and control surface failure training that includes full-motion replicators of stabilizer jams. Their rhythmic, tension-filled chatter in the last minutes of Flight 261 remains a core training module, proof that silent mechanical wear can crescendo into hollow echoes of tragedy. On October 31, 1999, Egypt Air Flight 990, a Boeing 767-300ER, departed New York's JFK Airport for Cairo. Captain Ahmed El-Habashi, First Officer Ayman Al-Kilani, and Relief Pilot Fadi Fakuri conducted standard checks in a quiet cockpit. At 01:30 EST, the CVR captured light conversation about passenger meal preferences and the mild autumn night below. At 01:41, as the aircraft passed FL 330 over Nantucket, a sudden, intentional sequence began. Relief Pilot Fakuri's voice crackled. Fakuri, in Arabic, "God help us all." Simultaneously, the control column moved sharply aft. On the FDR, pitch attitude jumped to +13 degrees, then down to 41 degrees, followed by full nose-down commands. Captain El-Habashi's calm queries turned to astonished commands. El-Habashi, urgent. "What are you doing? Pull back on the yoke." Fakuri's only response was muffled Arabic phrases, followed by a chilling laugh. The descent and silence. The CVR recorded 15 seconds of desperate struggle, lever clatters, rising engine thrust as the captain and first officer fought opposite inputs, and the ominous wind noise as the aircraft pitched into a dive. The stall oral warning sounded faintly, drowned by the roar of plunging descent. At 01:42, the CVR's last intelligible phrase cut through. El-Habashi, pleading in English. "Pull up! Pull up!" Then silence. Flight 990 crashed into the Atlantic, killing all 217 souls aboard. No distress call ever reached ATC. Conspiracy and controversy. The CVR tapes ignited fierce debate. Was this deliberate pilot action or mechanical failure? The NTSB concluded intentional inputs by relief pilot Fakuri. Egyptian authorities disputed the finding, citing inadequate evidence. The raw audio, Fakuri's final utterances, the captain's cries, became enshrined in both official reports and conspiracy theories. A dual legacy. In the wake of Egypt Air 990, airlines mandated psychosocial screening for flight crews, enhanced cockpit door security, and two-pilot rule enforcement on all passenger aircraft. New CVR requirements doubled recording duration from 30 to 120 minutes, ensuring that if controversy ever arose again, investigators would have more context. Voices carved in time. 12 secrets drawn from black box tapes, from tiny light bulb failures to whispered betrayals, reveal how flight recorders do more than collect data. They give voice to tragedy, courage, and human fallibility. Each crackle, scream, and syllable, preserved in those indestructible boxes, turns into a lesson that reshapes regulations, training, and aircraft design. As our hour-and-a-half journey ends, we carry with us the haunting realization that every flight's final seconds, no matter how silent to the world, echo forever in the guardians of the black box.